Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so we're diving deep into South Africa's fight against apartheid today. And wow, this one's really got me thinking already.
Yeah, it's really something, isn't it? Two leaders, both wanting to end the same oppressive system, but advocating for very different paths to get there.
It's a real study in contrast, like you said, but the way their legacies kind of weave together in this fight for freedom and equality, that's what's really fascinating to me.
It's crucial to understand the context, too, to really grasp their impact. We're talking about the brutal reality of apartheid here.
And I think sometimes people hear apartheid and they just think, separate water fountains or something. But it was so much deeper than that.
Exactly. It was a whole system designed to just strip away the humanity of Black South Africans. Imagine living in a society where your race dictates every single aspect of your life.
Where you can live, work, even the kind of education you're allowed to have.
It's hard to even fathom, right? And if you really want to understand just how insidious it was, think about some of those specific laws, like the Group Areas Act, for example.
Right, that one's huge. Because it wasn't just some abstract policy, it literally redrew the map of South Africa.
Forcing people into designated areas based solely on their race.
It's mind-boggling.
And then you've got the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which basically ensured Black South Africans wouldn't have the same opportunities. A separate and unequal education system, plain and simple. It was all meticulously designed to control and segregate. And it's against this backdrop that our first leader, Chief Albert Luthuli, comes in.
And he says this incredibly powerful thing. I've got to quote this here. He says, "Who will deny that 30 years of my life have been spent knocking in vain, patiently, moderately, and modestly at a closed and barred door?"
Wow. You can just feel the weight of those words, can't you? The frustration, years of facing roadblocks. But even with all of that, Luthuli never wavered in his belief in nonviolent resistance.
He really held on to that, even when faced with a system that seemed determined to crush any hope of equality. And that's what makes his leadership of the African National Congress, the ANC, even more fascinating, I think.
It's 1952 when he becomes president of the ANC, a time when the organization was moving towards more active resistance. Luthuli, he becomes a key figure in that shift. Think about campaigns like the Defiance Campaign, encouraging people to break discriminatory laws, but peacefully, as a form of protest. He really believed in shining that light on injustice, forcing the world to see it.
And then, 1960, something truly groundbreaking happens. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, wow, talk about a moment in history.
Absolutely. This wasn't just about Luthuli, though, right? It was a turning point for the entire anti-apartheid movement.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the world had to pay attention. And Luthuli, he used that platform brilliantly. He amplified the voices of the oppressed on a global scale, all because of his unwavering commitment to peaceful resistance. But as incredible as that was, you have to remember back in South Africa, a new generation was coming up, and they were seeing firsthand that peaceful protest might not be enough.
Yeah, they're experiencing the true brutality of apartheid, and that's where Nelson Mandela comes in.
Exactly. He starts to believe that a different kind of fight is needed.
And there were events, right? Things like that Sharpeville Massacre, those really impacted Mandela's thinking.
Absolutely. People peacefully protesting and met with unimaginable violence. It forced a lot of people to realize the regime might not change through peaceful means alone.
And that's where Umkhonto Sizwe comes in, right? The ANC's armed wing formed in 1961.
It was a turning point, that's for sure. Caused a real rift within the ANC, too. Some saw it as turning their backs on Luthuli's nonviolence.
But others felt like, what choice did they have?
It really shows how high the stakes were getting. They were desperate for change, and for some, this felt like the only way.
And Mandela becomes a central figure in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. One of the founders and leaders of MK. But it's crucial to understand, this wasn't about just violence for the sake of violence. Their targets were government installations, symbols of apartheid.
More about disrupting the regime than inflicting casualties.
Precisely. And you can really feel that struggle, the weight of that decision in Mandela's words during the Rivonia Trial in 1964.
He's facing life in prison at this point, right?
He is. And he stands there and delivers this incredibly powerful speech. He talks about cherishing a democratic and free society. Says it's something he hopes to live for, to achieve. But then, and this is the part that always gets me, he says, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Wow. That just sends chills down your spine, doesn't it? The conviction, it's incredible, but it really highlights the impossible situation, doesn't it? Two leaders, both wanting the same thing, a free and equal South Africa, but their methods are complete opposites.
It's true. And it makes you think about how complex the fight for social justice really is. There's so many sides to it.
Absolutely. It's rarely black and white. But you know what's interesting to me? Despite those differences, both Luthuli and Mandela became Nobel Peace Prize laureates.
That's always such a point of discussion, isn't it? How can that be? Two very different approaches, both recognized. Well, think about it this way. Luthuli's win in 1960, it shines a light on the horrors of apartheid for the whole world to see. Then, Mandela's shared award with de Klerk in 1993. It acknowledges their joint effort to dismantle apartheid and transition to a democratic South Africa peacefully.
It speaks to how the fight itself had to change over time, right? It wasn't about one man or one right way.
Exactly. It took decades, different tactics at different times. And the thing is, those seemingly opposing approaches, they actually work together.
Like two sides of the same coin, like you were saying earlier.
Exactly. And speaking of their interconnectedness, I've always wondered, what about those 27 years Mandela spent imprisoned? Do you think Luthuli's legacy, his belief in nonviolence, a shared future, could that have influenced Mandela during those years?
It's an interesting thought. I mean, Mandela wasn't just sitting in a cell doing nothing. He was studying, reflecting, corresponding with people.
Right. It's not hard to imagine Luthuli's ideas, his commitment to dialogue, to reconciliation, leaving their mark on Mandela.
It adds another layer to their story, doesn't it? Even in prison, Luthuli's presence was somehow still there.
And then when Mandela is released, think about how he emerged. Not filled with bitterness, but pushing for forgiveness and unity. It's like he took Luthuli's vision of a shared future and somehow, against all odds, made it happen.
And that leads us to their legacy. It's incredible when you think about it. Two very different men, both fighting for the same thing, and they changed their nation's history forever.
It really shows that these movements, these fights for social change, they're never simple. It's not always one leader, one right answer. Sometimes it takes different approaches, different voices to make real lasting change.
Yeah, even approaches that seem like they're the total opposite.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so fascinating about Luthuli and Mandela. Their stories, they kind of weave together, right? You get this more complete picture of what the fight for equality really looks like.
It's messy, you know? It's not a straight line.
And leadership. It's not about fitting into some perfect mold either. Luthuli, he was the moral compass. That unwavering belief in nonviolence, it set the stage for everything that came after. And then Mandela, he was willing to change, to get tougher when he had to. And ultimately, that's what brought apartheid down.
And then for Mandela to go through all of that, all those years in prison, and come out advocating for forgiveness, it's remarkable.
That's the power of Luthuli's legacy, though, isn't it? Even in prison, Mandela was carrying those ideals, that hope for a shared future, a South Africa where everyone belonged.
It really makes you realize their fight, it wasn't just about tearing down a system that was so clearly wrong. It was about what you build in its place. They wanted equality, a shared humanity, and that's something that still resonates today.
All over the world, people are still fighting those same fights.
And that's what I love about deep dives like this. You don't just learn about history, it makes you think about the world today, you know? It makes you ask yourself, what would I have done?
It's not always an easy question.
So we're leaving you with this. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you're living in South Africa during apartheid. Knowing what you know now about Luthuli and Mandela, which path would you choose? Would you hold on to that belief in nonviolence like Luthuli, hoping for a peaceful end? Or would you feel like you had to take a more, well, assertive approach like Mandela? It's a question we're thinking about. Because even today, the fight for justice, for equality, it's still going on. And we all have a role to play in that fight.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.